Hello and welcome to Moneylife News and Views. Last Friday, we had some kind of a big bank announcement. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman announced yet another round of bank mergers. Now, India will now have just about 12 or 15 large public sector banks, apparently. Many people are very, very excited about this, and they think this is what big bang reforms look like. And this is something that we probably saw in 1991 when Mr. Narasimha Rao, who was then the Prime Minister, had announced a series of measures. Now, does this amount to any sort of big bang reform or the big bank reforms? Well, I checked with a couple of former chairmen of public sector banks. One of them was was hopeful, and the other person was absolutely blunt. He said, if you combine two small mess, you get only a bigger mess. Well, I have a slightly different approach to this whole thing, and a slightly different way of looking at it, and that is the government's own track record of handling public sector banks over the years. I'm afraid no matter what anybody says and no matter how hopeful you may be, 5 years are over and we already have had experience of the BJP government's handling of public sector banks, and that experience, I'm afraid, is not very inspiring. Now, my mind goes back to January 2015, when, with great fanfare, with a lot of media publicity blitz, Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi went into a huddle with the chiefs of public sector banks to draw up an action plan for banking reforms. The 2-day top-level retreat, which happened, I think, in Pune, was attended by consultants like McKinsey, the Reserve Bank of India governor, secretaries of the finance ministry, and also Minister of State for Finance, Mr. Jayant Sinha, apart from the finance minister himself, which was Arun Jaitley at that time. This was really a top-level meeting. The Prime Minister apparently wanted, and this was all publicized at that time, that he wanted to achieve a broad consensus of what has gone wrong and what should be done both by banks as well as by the government to improve and consolidate the position of public sector banks. Now, at that time, the idea was the outline of the reform action plan and further deliberations, all that will take place in his presence, and the idea being that the government is now very, very serious about doing something about the PSBs, which were draining a lot of public money and were steeped in bad loans, which itself was slowing down the economy because banks were not able to lend. Well, at that time, that the banks needed a massive equity capital injection of 2.4 trillion or 2.4 lakh crores by 2018 to meet the Basel III norms. That was a major crisis at that time. And I'd said, if tough questions are not asked of the bankers who has created this kind of a horrible mess of bad loans, then we will have only a tinkering around the edges and the PSBs will preserve their status quo. And I listed down a little list of questions that the PM should be asking, really tough questions. Now, unfortunately, nothing came out of it. A Gyan Sangam was held again next year, and then forgotten. Everybody has forgotten all about it, and no other such top-level meetings have been held. Banks were found to be deeply involved in more and more scams, the Nirav Modi scam and this scam and that scam, and billions of rupees have gone out of the banking system. The bank needed a recapitalization and so on. So 5 years later, after that so-called Gyan Sangam, the PSBs are in a far worse shape. This was not the only initiative, because towards the end of 2015, that is in August 2015 to be precise, the government announced another scheme, and this was called Indradhanush. This was a 7-point scheme which promised better senior level appointments, setting up a banks board bureau, pumping in more capital, reducing bad loans, empowering the bank management, improving accountability, and better governance. 7 points. This was another flop show. The first three, which was senior level appointments, banks board bureau, and pumping in more capital, were easier for the government to do. So a BBB, or Banks Board Bureau, was indeed set up, and the banks got a lot of capital sometime around in 2018. But the recommendations of BBB were largely ignored. Now the government is again talking about empowering them, and so on. Now, my question, based on some of these things that we've seen in the last 5 years under a very decisive and a nationalist government, is reforming PSBs an economic objective at all? I've maintained that we know very little about this government, but I could very clearly say this was not an objective of the previous governments. The previous governments, each one of them from Mrs. Indira Gandhi's time, wanted actually to exploit the public sector banks for political reasons, right? So they needed PSBs under their control. There was no question of giving them freedom or accountability, nothing. There was all appointments were political. There was a lot of meddling in the way the public sector banks gave out loans, and so on and so forth. But this is a different government, right? So, but 5 years are over and nothing has happened at all. And I'm beginning to question even this government's intention, whether do they have any economic objective at all in reforming the PSBs, because there's no roadmap. We do not know anything what the government is thinking and where it wants to go and what it wants to do. We only know its words, and of course we can figure out from its actions. In the Gyan Sangam, Mr. Modi had asked banks to move to the second phase of Jan Dhan, and that is, believe it or not, promote financial literacy by encouraging competitions in schools, much like mock parliaments. He also instructed them to develop common strengths in advertising and help develop 20 to 25,000 Swachhata entrepreneurs. This was his ideas of public sector bank reforms. Offer loans to students despite huge bad loans on this account, and avoid what he called lazy banking. The PM also told the bankers that as part of corporate social responsibility, they should take up one sector each year to play a positive role. Now, this is a politician's thinking. This is a politician's agenda. And in fact, quite underwhelming and quite weird when public sector banks were facing a gigantic financial crisis. Now, here's another one. This is Mr. Jayant Sinha, who was a top-level consultant, was in a private equity and understands the capital market so very well. As a Minister of State for Finance, he had asserted in early 2015, if we dilute the stakes in public sector banks now, then we will be diluting at a distressed valuation. This is not what we are going to do. We need to increase the price to book multiples of PSBs and bring them at par with private sector banks. Yes, that laughable comment came from a very erudite and very polished and a very capital market savvy Minister of State. He said, it is our responsibility to ensure that if we are going to dilute our stake, which is the stake of the people of India, we'll do it at an appropriate valuation. Well, we all know valuations have collapsed since then as frauds and write-offs have ballooned. As I said, politicians live in their own world and talk what they think is attractive and which gets them the eyeballs. They probably don't mean a thing of what they say. Now the question is, will the bank mergers deal with the core issues that affect the public sector banks? And there is two. Corruption, deep-rooted corruption from top to bottom, and lack of incentives for employees. If they do a good job, nothing happens to them. If they do a bad job, again, nothing happens to them. So in a commercial organization, to have lack of incentives and to have corruption is absolutely debilitating. There's nothing that that any minister or any secretary can do unless these two things are removed. Now, there's a bigger issue, and this is where I'm guessing. I think the entire banking, entire financial services business is moved while the government is fumbling and using the PSBs to their own political ends. The business itself, the structure of the banking and the financing business itself has shifted. My question is, even if they are better capitalized and better governed, will the public sector banks after the merger be able to address tomorrow's challenge, which is competition and technology? I personally feel that there is a hollowing out of the entire landscape for the public sector banks. The business is going to go to small finance bank, to private sector banks, to newer banks, to finance companies which are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I do not see any reason why high quality businesses will ever go to public sector banks. So this is a huge new challenge. This is not the challenge of the past, which is corruption and lack of incentives and lack of capital and lack of accountability and lack of governance. This is a new business challenge, which I do not know if the public sector banks themselves understand. They have no incentive or they don't have a skin in the game to understand. And I am quite certain the politicians don't even want to deal with any of this. They just want to use the PSBs, unfortunately. And that's my take about what's happening in the PSBs. Thanks for watching.